Already today we've heard how much is going on in global politics, but there is as much going on in global economics and in trade and investment. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, it wasn't that long ago that we talked very confidently about the benefits of globalization and open markets, of free trade and trade agreements, and now it all seems to be very different. So to help us to understand where the global trading environment is, particularly in Asia, we've assembled a terrific panel. Um, and that panel will also explore how Australia can make its way in that environment. We've seen recently the launch of the government Southeast Asia strategy. We still have an important economic relationship with China, with, as Richard mentioned, exports booming this year. So all these questions will be covered. We'll start, though, with a presentation from Albert Park. Albert Park is our very special guest for Asia Briefing Live here in Melbourne and tomorrow in Sydney. He's the chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. Albert is enormously experienced. He has 20 years' experience as a development economist um, and is also an expert on the Chinese economy. So it'll be great to hear from him. Albert will kick off the session by making a presentation. He'll then be joined by two Australian business leaders, Chris Andrews, the Chief Executive Officer of La Trobe Financial. Chris has 20 years experience also in the financial markets, but despite that is one of the youngest CEOs in the banking and financial services industry in Australia. And also joining us will be Louise Adams, the Chief Operating Officer of Aurecon. Louise is responsible for driving all areas of the business to achieve the group's strategic goals. Also a very experienced operator, and we're very pleased that both Chris and Louise will be able to join Albert after his presentation, and that conversation will be moderated again by Amy Bainbridge from Bloomberg. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Albert Park.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. Every year, well, 4 times a year, ADB issues updated forecasts for growth and inflation for the region. And twice a year in April and then the most recent September 20th, we issue very detailed forecasts and descriptions of the outlook for each individual country in developing Asia. And we define developing Asia as including 46 economies, including Central West Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Pacific. Um, Includes almost every country you can imagine, except for Japan, because they are not a developing member country of the Asian Development Bank. So let me just get right into it and start with some of the main messages from this year's, the most recent outlook. And I'm also kind of added a little bit extra content on China and the Pacific because I thought that would be of interest to this audience. Oh, I have the slide here. So broadly, we feel that growth in developing Asia is resilient. It's been relatively upbeat recently with healthy domestic demand, rebounding tourism, strong remittances, improving financial conditions, and China's reopening, leaving the zero COVID policy behind, has also been a boost to growth in the region. However, the demand coming from advanced economies for exports from Asia has been very weak, and concerns about the property market issues in China is creating concerns about the outlook and create some risk to the outlook. So our headline numbers are that we're forecasting that economic growth in developing Asia will be 4.7% this year. That's a slight downgrade from our estimate earlier in the year, which was 4.8%. And for next year, we're maintaining our forecast at 4.8%. Inflation continues to moderate. So we're projecting that it will decline from 4.4% last year to 3.6% this year and 3.5% next year. Although if you exclude China, the numbers are a bit higher, and I'll explain that in a minute. And in terms of risk to the outlook, they've intensified recently. especially with the uncertainty over the outlook for China, but also continued concerns about financial stability, given high interest rate environment, uh, higher debt levels in many countries in the region, and still challenges to growth. And of course, there are other challenges like climate change, El Nino weather this year, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and geopolitical fragmentation. So let me talk about some of the components of demand that's driving growth in the region. This is a bit of a complicated figure, but it covers the growth in the second half of last year and the first half of this year for most of the major economies that account for about 80% of GDP in Asia. And you can see from the left-hand two bars that growth really uh, came up at the first half of this year from 3.9% second half of last year to 5.1%. And a lot of that was driven by healthy consumption, which is the dark blue shaded area, and investment, which is the green shaded area. And um, China was an important part of that. You can see China went from 3.4% to 5.5%. And again, with a healthy rebound in consumption and spending, especially in services as people's mobility returned to normal pretty quickly. Um, However, you can see in the middle group of countries, which are kind of the high-tech exporting economies in Asia, that these negative blue bars are the negative contribution of declining exports, and that's really dragged down performance, in particular in Korea and in Taipei, China. On the right are the four largest ASEAN economies, and here you can see growth is actually moderating. It's still a bit slower the first half of this year compared to the second half of last year. Uh, that's mainly due, again, to some challenges related to declining demand for exports out of Southeast Asia, and also kind of the slowing down of some of the recovery from the pandemic. But you can still see the rates of growth are still reasonably high and driven, again, by domestic consumption and investment. So in this slide, presenting some of the figures on industrial production and services. And on the left-hand side, there's plots industrial production indices. And you can see that there's a lot of variation across countries in the region. So some countries like the Philippines and India have shown very steady growth, positive performance in industry. Whereas on the opposite side, you have Taipei, China, Korea not doing as well. There's some optimism here. We start to see kind of looks like a slight recovery in the most recent data, in particular for Vietnam, which is now moving back into positive growth territory. And even Korea and China, you can see, are improving. So the right-hand side are the manufacturing PMIs for different countries in the region. As you know, anything above 50, which is shaded in green, is expansion. Anything that's red is below 50 and is contraction. And again, you can see there's a big differences. India and Indonesia have had PMIs well above 50 throughout this period that's being covered this year, whereas there are some economies, Korea, Malaysia, Taipei, China, that have been below 50 for the entire year, and others that have kind of been bouncing back and forth. But encouragingly, in the most recent numbers in August, we see China and Vietnam nudging above 50. So again, showing some improvement. The bottom panels look at the limited services PMI data that's available in the region. And again, you see services are quite robust. India and China have been above 50 the whole year. And in general, throughout the region, the services sector has been really a key sector for supporting growth. One of the things that's been supporting continuing recovery has been tourism. And you can see on the left-hand side chart that as of the end of last year, tourism in Asia had come back about 50% relative to pre-pandemic levels. But by this year to date, it's come back up to 70%. So it's definitely on the right path. Some of the economies like Armenia, Maldives, Fiji have come all the way back and are now back in above pre-pandemic levels. A lot of the countries in Southeast Asia, we see a little bit lagging recovery, and that's because they've relied more on the Chinese tourist that has been slow to come back. So Chinese tourists have come back to about 40% of pre-pandemic levels thus far. The right-hand side presents some data on money transfers or remittances. The left-hand side shows remittances from economies that have a lot of outbound labor migration. And you can see that for the most part, the levels of remittances remain above pre-pandemic levels, which is kind of indexed relative to 100. Um, and in particular, in the Pacific, we see very robust remittances in places like Fiji and Samoa. And then on the right-hand side, we look at some of the remittance patterns for Caucasus and Central Asia. And this is notable because you can see there's been kind of a decline in recent months, but after a really large increase. And this is related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we saw lots of Russian money and people moving to neighboring countries in this region. And we thought that benefit would fade, but it's actually persisted much more strongly into this year. So remittances still remain well above pre-pandemic levels. So I added a slide here on labor migration from the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. I was just in the Pacific a couple of weeks ago, and this topic, this labor mobility topic, is definitely top of mind among policymakers and the business community. And you can see in particular these orange bars. These are the work visa approvals. They've really increased dramatically as Australia has liberalized kind of its um, permissions for work visas coming from the Pacifics. And in particular, in the first half of 2023, there have been more work visa approvals in Australia than all of last year. Now, obviously, this brings many benefits for migrants coming from these regions because wages are much higher if they can come to Australia or New Zealand. But it does create some pressures on local labor markets in terms of the shortages of workers. And so you hear the business communities complaining. And I think that means that we have to maximize kind of the benefits of this migration to encourage investments and remittances back. And we also need to think about how to increase labor supply locally through more training or more liberalized immigration or other ways to encourage greater labor force participation. Okay, so in terms of the global outlook, global factors, GDP growth in advanced countries like the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, I mean, uh, generally are a bit better than we expected earlier. This year's growth is better, it's a bit stronger, but we're forecasting slightly lower growth next year. Still a pretty slow growth and slow demand recovery in the advanced economies. On the right-hand side, in terms of commodity prices, oil prices, we're forecasting an average price of $83 this year and $86 next year. The current price is $88. There was a big bump up recently after OPEC plus supply cuts, but we still see this as staying at this moderately high level. What's concerning to us is the rice price, which is the black line here, and there's been a spike up in rice prices very recently, and it's due to poor monsoons in India and India's decision to restrict exports of rice. And India accounts for like 40% of the international rice market, so that's had a huge effect and creates food security concerns. So ironically, after Russian invasion of Ukraine, much of the world had food security concerns because of the spike in wheat and corn prices, but the rice price in Asia was very stable, and that's the more important staple commodity. But now we're seeing the opposite with wheat and corn prices being stable, but now rice prices shooting up. So in terms of the overall forecast for the region, um, overall, we're seeing growth rates kind of return back to pre-pandemic levels, both for the region as a whole and for most of the sub-regions. There's a little bit of differences in Caucasus and Central Asia where growth is higher than before from unexpected benefits of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then a bit lower in East Asia because of the slowdown in China. So the right-hand side chart presents the main forecast for the region and subregions. The fastest growing region is South Asia, thanks to India. So we're projecting India to grow at 6.3% this year, 6.7% next year. Very robust demand and investment, a young population, a lot of pro-growth infrastructure investment, and even some fiscal loosening to support consumption. So it looks good, although they had a bad harvest, so we actually slightly downgraded our forecast for this year. Then the next most dynamic region is Southeast Asia. And here we're downgrading a bit for the reasons I described earlier, but we're forecasting 4.6% this year, 4.8% next year. And the two economies that are growing fastest are the Philippines and Vietnam. In East Asia, China is the main economy. Our forecast has been downgrading slightly to 4.9% this year and 4.5% next year. And the ambassador presented some numbers which are not exactly right. We issued our forecast on September 20th. World Bank on October 1st revised their forecast down to 5.1% this year, 4.4% next year. IMF just yesterday released updated forecast 5% this year, 4.2% next year. And we're at 4.9% this year, which is a little bit below the others. But that's before some good news from the August numbers came out. And then our forecast for next year is 4.5%. So everything's reasonably close. Some of the issues about Chinese growth is how is the slowdown in China affecting other economies in the region? And one thing we see is that imports from China declined this year. Of course, that hurts other countries in the region. In particular, there was a decline in machinery and electrical equipment imports. Accounts for about a third of Chinese imports, and about half of those are coming from other countries in Asia. The property sector, as I mentioned, all the numbers are negative in recent months, whether you look at real estate investment, property sales, floor space, land sales, and this really reflects a long-term decision to try to deleverage an overheated sector where there's been oversupply, because local governments had a very strong incentive to overdevelop land as a source of revenue. And I think China has been trying to manage that process, but it's a bit tricky. And if they can get a soft landing in this sector and get to it contributing back to positive growth, that will, of course, be very beneficial. But we're never going to go back to the earlier periods where the property sector contributed about 2% of growth per year. And if you look at kind of the growth projections for China, they really are following long-term trends. So China's growth will slow. Last year was the first year where China's expected growth was below the average expected growth for the region, which means that a lot of the dynamism is shifting from China to South Asia and Southeast Asia. Although because China accounts for like half of GDP in the region, it's still going to be extremely important and account for most of the overall growth, both in the region and globally. So there are a bunch of structural factors, which maybe I can talk to more in the Q&A. So I'm out of time. So a word about inflation. You can see inflation is coming down, and it's coming down mainly for energy and food prices, which are the gray and orange shaded areas, but it's also coming down in terms of core inflation, which is the yellow area. The Chinese numbers in the middle were negative in July, but bounced to positive in August. And we think those are short-term factors related to, there was a real spike in pork prices last year, and then this year that came up as negative inflation, but we're projecting a return to positive inflation of 2.4% next year. And then in other regions across the board, we're seeing forecasts of declining inflation. Okay, my second to last slide, sorry, is about regional economic integration. So all of the discussion about decoupling, de-risking, et cetera, but we are trying to inform this conversation with evidence. And one thing we do at ADB is we come up with a quantitative measures of regional economic integration. And across a number of measures, what you see in Asia is that despite kind of the narrative of deglobalization globally, within Asia, we see deepening regional economic integration. This chart presents data from 2006 and 2022, and this is the pattern that we see. And the other important point about this integration is that China is really still heavily connected. In fact, probably more so than before in terms of their importance to regional supply chains. So let me end with this slide that presents the key risks to the outlook. It's China's fragile recovery, elevated financial stability risk because of continued high interest rates and high debt levels, food security challenges related to the high rice price, and El Nino weather, climate change, etc. And then monetary stance in the U.S. always is important to the financial outlook in the region. It's not clear whether the U.S. will continue to raise rates or keep them higher for longer, but that certainly will have many implications. Let me stop there, and then we can maybe have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Albert, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. We look forward to having some more insights through this conversation with you as well. And we appreciate you coming here to Melbourne in what is an extremely busy week for you. So thank you very much. A reminder of our panellists who've already been introduced, of course, Louise Adams, the Chief Operating Officer of Aurecon. Welcome. And Chris Adams, the Chief Executive Officer of Trobe Financial. I will remind you again that the QR code is ready and waiting for you again. If you can respond to the survey question this time, which is which country in the region presents the biggest opportunity for Australian business? And we'll check in with that poll a little later in the session. First, to kick things off, Albert, I will give you a little rest for a moment. You can catch your breath. But Louise, Chris, the government just last month released its Southeast Asia economic strategy, and it found that investment in the region has not moved at pace with the region's growth. Chris, perhaps one for you to start with. Why do you think Australian investment in Southeast Asia is a bit underdone? What are the main factors there?
Yeah, great question, Amy. The first point I'd make, I think, is it's absolutely critical that we do engage more deeply with Southeast Asia. These are our people. It's our geography, it's our past, it's our future. Anyone who's travelled through Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, throughout the region, Vietnam, Philippines, there's already really deep ties in place. And that's exciting because this is going to be one of the real engines of world growth through the second half of the 21st century and even before that. They're young, dynamic populations, I think about 700 million in total. So it's an incredibly exciting opportunity for Australia apart from anything else. Certainly speaking from a financial services perspective, and we've been engaging through Southeast Asia for many years, probably the main obstacles that we find at a practical business level is, you're dealing in every jurisdiction with a slightly different set of regulatory requirements that have some similar characteristics. So there's a lot of capital requirements, local directorship requirements, sometimes ownership requirements in local jurisdictions that do make it more difficult as a financial services organisation. Sometimes our best intentions are stymied by currency controls, which are in place for other sets of reasons. So it is super encouraging, I've got to say, to see the government call that out in its strategy and put that as a real focus and priority item for the future. I think the appointment of Nick Moore to oversee the Southeast Asian engagement is a really, really good one because he's got very practical, coal-faced experience, I think, in dealing with these sorts of issues. So that's incredibly prospective. But it's also on us here in this room. We all have a privileged seat at the table, if you like, in contributing to the future and the growth of the relationships between Southeast Asia. And so it's incumbent on us as business to lean in as well.
Louise, your thoughts on that? Why do you think we've been a little underinvested in the region?
Yeah, look, I think to reiterate some of Chris's points, I think there could be a myriad of different reasons. If you think about the history of business potentially in Australia going to somewhere like China and finding the demand quite overwhelming, then it doesn't necessitate the need to really look further afield, or maybe even some slight comfort in potentially ignoring Asia altogether and finding comfort in more of a historical, traditional trade partners. And so I think there's all manner of reasons, but I'm quite excited, as Chris said, I agree with that, the opportunity for us to lean into our region, into our neighbours. It's quite nice to see Vietnam coming out on the top there, because one of the things that I was going to talk to, which I think is an opportunity, I love the strategy, but at the end of the day, business and industry is going to have to bring this strategy to life. And one of the opportunities, I think, I was privileged enough a couple of years ago to be asked to be a business champion on a piece of work that the Australia Vietnam Policy Institute, heavily supported by the Asia Society and RMIT, and there's a few members of the team here in the audience. They developed a methodology where they put in place 3 Australian business champions, and the Vietnamese government did the same in Vietnam. And we went round to each of the capital cities in Australia, and the business champions facilitated conversations with businesses that were either heavily invested in trade with Vietnam or interested in it. And we had really practical conversations around the question of what needs to be true to rapidly increase this bilateral trade. And then we put out a heap of policy papers off the back of each of those, and we went and met the business champions in Australia and Vietnam, met with the 2 trade ministers, and eventually the output was a recommendations report that simply said to the Australian government, if you want this strategy to come to life, here's 8 recommendations of things we think that you need to do from a business, from a industry perspective, to make that easier for us to grab and then bring to life. And I think, and this is partly when Nick Moore is focused, is exactly those sort of conversations. How do we unlock, not just make this a government strategy, but how do we tangibly put this in the hands of industry and make it as easy as it can be for industry on both sides to accelerate this growth? So huge opportunities there.
What was the reception like to Australia on the ground over there?
Very positive. I mean, I think, like is always the case, if you can find, there is a willing on both sides. And, this year is the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Australia and Vietnam. So that was quite timely and quite an exciting narrative there for both sides. And I think that and we've heard a bit about it this morning, I think Asia is quite open and welcoming of Australia coming in and being an active participant in the region for a whole manner of reasons. So, yeah, it was quite positive. And certainly when we sat down with the trade ministers on both sides, there's mutual benefit in making this work, in building these relationships and growing this opportunity.
Albert Park, given the economic outlook that you gave us for the region, where do you see opportunities for countries like Australia to strengthen trade and investment?
Well, I'm very, very interested in these
It's
polling results.
interesting.
I'm a bit surprised that Vietnam is so far out in front. But I think broadly, Southeast Asia is the most, I think, dynamic region in Asia, and so should be a focus. I took a look at the investment strategy document on Southeast Asia, and they identify a number of sectors that are promising, which I think are really sensible. Ones that I particularly kind of think have potential are, digitalization, because we've seen digital services trade is the most dynamic part of the global economy today. Also, importantly, I saw a recent figure showing that, the middle class, the rising middle class globally, much of it is happening in Asia, in China, India, and in Southeast Asia. So thinking about where those markets are going to be increasing faster are places probably also that would be good to get in. India, it's still a much smaller economy than China. It's growing fast, but it has kind of a protectionist aspect of some of the policymaking. We've seen import tariffs actually increasing over the last 5 years or so. It has still a labor force where the education system doesn't perform that well, high informality in labor market. So there are challenges, I think, to invest in trade with India. But given how fast it's growing and how big it is, I think it's important to be thinking about opportunities there. But I think Southeast Asia, some of the economies in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Philippines, are doing quite a lot in kind of digital innovation, platform innovation, apps, and I think they're very dynamic places. Maybe I'll stop there.
Oh, no, it's interesting. I mean, and I guess just a side comment when you talk about Indonesia. So last year there was a delegation of superannuation funds that headed over to Indonesia to talk about opportunities there, and we're sort of yet to see what materializes from things like that. Is it better to set up an office and have a permanent presence somewhere like India or Indonesia and get investment through that way? Or is it better to have these, I guess, high level delegations to go and talk? And perhaps, Albert, you can speak to that, but also our businesses might have a view on if you're going to look to invest more in the region, like how do you actually go about it? What's the most effective way?
I think, of course, it makes sense to have more presence if you're targeting that and do everything you can. But it also depends to some extent on your diagnosis of the problem, right? If it's really something about regulations and other things, that's one thing you need to deal directly with them. But if it's also just about not really understanding the market that well, or uh, knowing who to talk to get things done, or who are the best partners in different subsectors, then you just need to develop that knowledge. And the only way to do that is to either have a presence there or make the investments to go out and reach out.
Amy, can I speak to that too? It's sometimes hard for individual businesses to make out a business case because it can be quite expensive to set up an office. What was incredibly successful in our view, sort of 10 years back or so, was, to pick the Victorian government, for example, it had a really good network of sort of trade representatives throughout Southeast Asia, and they would aggregate all of the knowledge and they'd provide continuity in the region. So when you turned up as a business in the area, there was a portal, if you like, to plug into the local market. And the local market saw through these representatives continuity, and they saw real commitment from Australia, in this case at a state government level, to the region. And that's incredibly useful. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that was rolled up, which is a shame. And we all know, the budget dollar has pressures on it from every direction. But if we're serious about this, putting in place that sort of infrastructure, I think, is incredibly useful.
Louise?
Yeah, look, I think from our perspective, I mean, our world is infrastructure, and therefore having the presence on the ground is really the only way to get involved in the development of infrastructure in any location. And we probably found, having about a 40 years history throughout Asia for our organisation, what we have achieved in the last 10 years when we sort of really invested in localised leadership, finding either local leaders or long-term Australian expats who had long, extensive history in Asia. What we've achieved in the last 10 years, having that approach versus trying to run it from Australia, it's been quite transformational for us.
Makes all kinds of practical sense, I guess, but the challenge would be setting up the office and getting the right staff, I imagine, in the first place. Look, let's move to China's economy. I know we were speaking about China earlier in the day, and we've been focusing more broadly on the region. But Chris, look, as you know, we heard the ambassador speak earlier about the stabilisation of relations. How would you describe the current Australian business sentiment towards China after what has been a reasonably challenging few years in that bilateral relationship?
It's been a hell of a roller coaster ride. Look, I think the attitude generally is still very positive. I mean, let's be cut straight to the point. Australia isn't going anywhere. China isn't going anywhere. We've got incredibly deep relationships. China is still, by the length of the strait, our number one trading partner, and we've got people-to-people relationships that go back over a century with China. So there's an incredible reservoir of goodwill, I think, on both sides of the fence. Now, then there are the geopolitical challenges that overlay that, and it is true that the use perhaps of trade policy as part of that geopolitical game of chess has injected a note of caution, I think, in business, and that will probably stay for some time. I think the most useful question, again, talking as a business leader, what do we do about that? How do we think about that? And I think for business, the natural setting and the proper setting in this case is to keep some measured optimism. There is so much opportunity for productive work and the development of goodwill, personal relationships between Australia and China. we keep a watchful and measured eye, obviously, on the geopolitics. But again, I say it's on us in this room. We've got to lean into the relationship and build these thick networks between our countries, which I think over time will help deal with some of the more complex issues that we have to deal with at a geopolitical level.
Yeah, and sometimes you can see the headlines of what's going on in that bilateral relationship, but you also need to, I guess, consider what's happening. And, the long history of, I guess, businesses, chambers of commerce that do a lot of good work and have developed really deep relationships over the years. Albert Park, you did speak about this, and perhaps we can drill a little bit more into your presentation. You spoke about the post-COVID era and China reopening its borders and its economy, yet things are still, there are still headwinds. How do you see the structural issues and challenges affecting China's economy going forward? And I guess talking more deeply, not just about inflation pressures, but what it's going to mean for everyone else in the region and the impact there.
Yeah, so a lot of people are asking, is the current slowdown in China cyclical or structural? And I think it's a bit of both. I think there will be still more counter-cyclical recovery from the pandemic, which will benefit growth in China. That said, there are structural barriers to growth in China, and one big one is demographics. It's a rapidly aging society. The absolute size of the labor force is decreasing. Also, China's been experiencing a productivity slowdown ever since the great financial crisis. And I think that reflects a number of things about just falling returns to investment as they keep investing. It's been an investment-focused economy. But also, I think it reflects kind of forgetting some of the early lessons from the early part of reform. I think they really need to unleash the private sector much more to really capture productivity growth. That's where actually productivity growth came throughout the reform period, is the non-state sector. But now you see, I think, more of a tilt in the playing field that makes private businessmen feel a variety of risks, from regulatory risk to differential financial access, et cetera. So that's an important area for China. They announced a set of ambitious kind of reforms to support the private sector earlier this summer, but I think we'll just have to see. I think everyone's taking a cautious attitude to see if that really transpires. So maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Of course. Look, we've had a question from the audience, and of course we do welcome questions from the audience. Staying with that theme, but perhaps more broadly beyond China, in your view, Albert, are rice prices already factored into inflation in the region, or is it particularly likely to result in additional rises or perhaps continued inflation? And you did have some interesting comments on what was happening in India in that regard in your presentation.
Right. So rice prices are reflected in our forecasts because I think the spike occurred before our kind of closing date for information that goes into the forecast. And I'm not so concerned about overall inflation, but I think governments need to think about how the rice price affects vulnerable groups within the population and take measures to try to address food security concerns. I mean, obviously in the short term, you just want to support families or vulnerable groups. We are urging governments not to try to intervene in the price directly through subsidies or export controls. That's really costly and sends the wrong kind of price signals to both your consumers and your producers. But try to provide more targeted support, which can kind of preserve fiscal space and give these economies more leeway to use the scarce funds for other important purposes to meet more medium to longer term growth objectives. I also think that, this happened even earlier in the pandemic, where there were a lot of export restrictions on different food commodities when food price inflation was high. I think there does need to be more regional dialogue and coordination and thinking together how we should address these issues before the next crisis, so that people feel that there are responses that they can take without resorting to these distorting. Because when you restrict exports, you're really imposing very big negative externalities on other countries that really need to import food, especially places like the Pacific.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the green economy and clean energy. Louise, Adams, one for you. Of course, we are committed to net zero here in Australia. How integral is it to Asian partners that a business has sustainability credentials?
Yeah, look, in our experience, I would say it is becoming incredibly important. And I think that one of the underlying factors in that is that uh, broadly all over Asia, the impacts of climate change are being felt and will continue to be felt. And whether that's, what you see playing out in Singapore, in the island itself, or through to places like the Mekong Delta, where they're starting to feel the impact, speaking of rice, on their ability to use the traditional methods they've used for forever to grow rice, with the infiltration of more saline water into the delta itself. All of these are impacts of climate change. So there is a natural requirement and a drive from partners to look to organisations heading into Asia for those credentials. But then I think it is another classic case of realising that Asia is not a singular grouping, that it's a very different journey. You might find, we certainly find that in countries that are potentially further along the development cycle, and that they will look at this purely as a net zero, similar to how we are. We've committed to net zero. What does that look like? What does decarbonisation look like across our economy, and how do we tackle that? Whereas other countries that perhaps are more focused on development, they're looking more at GDP growth, or they might be looking at health and education. They might take a broader view of sustainability. Um, and I think for Australian companies going into Asia, you have to be willing to adapt to what the need is in the given country. That said, there is massive opportunities, I think, for Southeast Asia and Australia in particular to come together to really work to solve some of these problems, and pressure applied also from the Pacific Islands, who, of course, this is a massive concern for them. So I think there's a role, if we think about technology, where are the opportunities for Australia and Southeast Asia to develop technologies? Where's there opportunities for the more mature countries like Australia and Singapore to provide the frameworks for how to look at sustainability to some of the other developing countries? Plenty of opportunities for us to become quite close. And from Australia's perspective, also to find ways where where we become essential to Southeast Asia in this journey. That for me would be the ultimate goal, is that we can play a real part in not only doing this for ourselves, but doing this together with Southeast Asia. So I think it is becoming more and more essential, and very much part of the day-to-day conversation of doing business up there.
Albert, which countries are leading the way with the energy transition in the region?
Well, I wanted to say first that, in addition to digitalization and rising middle class, I actually think renewable energy and other aspects of climate change adaptation as well are really big growth business areas in the region. And even infrastructure, creating more resilient infrastructure, which means higher quality infrastructure in different dimensions, is really, there's a huge demand, and something that we're really promoting at the Asian Development Bank. And ADB is now really focused on becoming the climate bank for Asia. And we have reformed our capital adequacy framework so that we're going to be lending a lot more money than in the past. We announced a $100 billion increase in lending over the next 10 years, which will increase our activities by like 40%, and much of it focused on supporting the green transition. In the region, China is, of course, really a key country. They're leading in many ways, and we know they're leading technologically in solar, wind, and other aspects. And they're also very serious about meeting their net zero pledge. But really, throughout the region, all of the major economies have committed to net zero. And so they're all coming with different strategies and plans. It differs, of course, in emphasis, as was mentioned, but it's still generally more will happen in the future. And in terms of kind of carbon pricing schemes, emissions trading schemes, China just nationalized its scheme, but Indonesia has announced they're going to do one. India is setting one up. Vietnam has. So this, really taking on climate in a serious way is now, I think, becoming more and more prevalent across the region. So it's a big opportunity.
I think we've just got a couple of minutes left until we need to wrap up the panel. Chris, one for you. Given the fragmentation across the region and the threat of decoupling between the US and China, do you feel that trade is becoming less open?
It would be silly of me to deny that that's a risk, Amy. And, the world could possibly survive in that situation, but it would be a world where we were all poorer where the world generally would be less dynamic and more fearful. So that's not an attractive proposition on my assessment. Others in the room might differ, of course. So again, sort of doubling down on what I was talking about earlier. What's our response to that? And the response to that, I think, is that we need again to be optimistic and we need to be advocates for free trade. Funnily enough, talking about China and Australia are two of the showcase beneficiaries of the benefits of free trade. Both economies over the last 30 or 40 years have benefited enormously from free and open trade and a world in which trade is, on most measures, has been, at least until recently, getting freer. So it would be a terrible tragedy if all of that progress was destroyed. So I acknowledge the geopolitical tensions and countries do have to make sensible decisions about supply chain security. I mean, that was clear through COVID, right? Supply chains perhaps were excessively optimized and so a little bit fragile because of that. So there's sense around that, and there'll always be national security implications. But I still think that there is plenty of fertile ground for work to be done for liberalising trade for the benefit. This isn't just numbers. This is for the benefit of the people of the world. And free trade has been the greatest engine for bringing people out of really grinding poverty, particularly in China, over the last 30 or 40 years. So I just can't think but that it would be a tragedy if that were reversed.
Louise, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think I would argue that protectionism is playing out far more aggressively in some other regions in the world. And I think we've got to be careful not to think that the use of trade as a weapon to drive geopolitical desires is not something that happens everywhere and has always happened. And I agree with what Chris has said. I think there's enough intent throughout Asia, and Australia has signalled its clear intent that we can move beyond that. One of the big opportunities that I would say Australia has, and it was certainly a recommendation that came out of our work in Vietnam, was I don't think we should underestimate the potential that resides in the alumni from our universities, that resides either as Asians that have stayed in Australia and continue to work in Australia, and we need to make it as easy as we can to do that, notwithstanding the comments that Albert made about the impact that might have back in Asia, but also those that choose to return to Asia. If you think about what Tanvi said about India, and I think it's true in any sort of international trade relations, one of the most difficult things is spanning the different cultural approaches to how you do trade. And I think where we have people that have come to Australia and know their own country and know how our country works and have good relationships, being able to leverage that more than we have in the past is a really important opportunity.
The Colombo Plan, anyone?
Albert Park, countries in the West now talk of de-risking and trusted supply chains. China is doing its own decoupling. What is happening in supply chains, and should we be worrying about fragmentation of the global economy?
Well, if you look at the evidence, the strongest evidence for fragmentation is in terms of foreign direct investment flows. And there's been a very sharp decline in FDI into China, especially in strategic sectors, high-tech sectors. If we look at trade data, though, it's much less obvious how much is really changing. I think, Asia has signed the RCEP agreement, which gives an institutional base for keeping trade and investment open, and even more open in terms of developing more complex supply chains in the regions. And we see China still involved. So we know that some trade activity has shifted away from China to countries like Vietnam, which is now exporting much more to the U.S. in the goods that the U.S. imposed tariffs on China. But then we also see that, in many cases, Chinese investment has also increased into other countries to create bases of production that are not in China, so not subject to the tariffs, and also that there are trade flows that go from China to, let's say, Vietnam, and then Vietnam to the U.S. So China still seems to be an important player. And the one point I like to make about fragmentation is that, the research that tries to study the impacts of real, much more aggressive decoupling between a China group and a U.S. group finds that the countries most hurt are not China or the U.S., but it's these third-party countries, these smaller economies that trade with both countries that are hurt the most. Because China and the U.S. are really large economies with large domestic markets and many trading partners. They can adjust much more than a small economy. And so if these countries are asked to choose, number one, they're going to really resist because they're going to clearly perceive that it's in their interest. And you can see all across Southeast Asia, and even when I was in the Pacific, countries are trying to balance the pressures they're getting and the opportunities that are coming from China and the US. And I think hopefully that can actually reap benefits for many of the countries in the region.
Great. Look, we're going to leave it there. I've probably got 30 seconds each if anyone had some closing thoughts or comments on the key themes to today. I mean, is there cause for optimism, do we think, as we sit here today?
Yeah, I think there is a cause for optimism, and I think it's a big part of Australia maturing as a significant player in its own neighbourhood. To go back to the opening comments that Chris made, this is our neighbourhood. These are our people. So I think it's exciting that what we could achieve.
Chris?
Yeah, I would say optimism, not just as a sort of a rational assessment of the facts on the ground, but also a practical solution. Pessimism breeds more suspicion and becomes ultimately a self-fulfilling prophecy, in my view. And maybe we're teetering on a risk of that at the moment. And so I think, certainly in terms of business leaders, we need to be forward leading. We need to be optimistic, and we need to be looking for the opportunities amongst the complexity.
Thank you. Albert?
So I think for the foreseeable future, Asia will remain by far the most dynamic region of the world. And so I think that presents lots of opportunities for Australia because they're so close. And I think in terms of what Australia produces and has skills in, I think they're very well positioned to benefit from the continued rise of Asia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for listening to our session. Albert Park, who's visiting our region, Louise Adams from Aurecon, and Chris Andrews from Trobe Financial. That wraps up that session for today, and we'll make way for the next fireside chat. Thank you.